So my name is Jonathan Marshall. On behalf of the West Virginia University College of Law, the Veterans Advocacy Clinic, as well as the Center for Consumer Law and Education, this is the first production of our People's Law School. And the concept behind this was to actually provide and take the law to the people who need it most, the people. And so this is the first of many different sessions where we will be covering a series of consumer topics that hopefully enable consumers to better advocate for themselves. Now, the topic for today is top 10 things you should know about consumer law and where to get help. Now, I will tell you that we're actually providing a lot more information than that. So several different top 10 lists, as well as a lot of other consumer-related information. And as we proceed through the presentation, by all means, if anybody has any questions, let me know. So with that said, I want to start out with a little bit about the Center for Consumer Law and Education. The Center for Consumer Law and Education was just established in November of last year. And basically, the mission of the center is to provide service to students, service to policymakers, service to the public. And so we're here as part of our mission to serve the public. The center itself has a website. It's thechecle.org. The materials that we have here at this session will be made available on the website. Additionally, we will have a video recording that will also be made available. So if you want more information, by all means, check out the website. We also have a YouTube channel. The YouTube channel is linked to our website, and on the YouTube channel you can get a series of other videos, how-to, where-tos, and similar types of materials. So, consumer protection. John F. Kennedy said this in 1962. Consumers, by definition, include us all. They are the largest economic group in the economy, affected by almost every public and private economic decision. 2/3 of all spending in the economy is by consumers. But they are the only important group in the economy who are not effectively organized, whose views are not often heard. This movement started in 1962, a whirlwind of change in America. After John F. Kennedy made this call, you saw the passage of a series of consumer protection statutes by Congress as well as by states. And this movement has progressed for a period of time, and it's important. As John F. Kennedy indicated, we're all consumers. Everybody in this room is a consumer. We all buy things, and we are affected by the decisions that are made. When we are ripped off, when we suffer, the economy suffers. And there's actually another piece to this I do want to read. John F. Kennedy actually also said, if consumers are offered inferior products, if prices are exorbitant, if drugs are unsafe or worthless, if the consumer is unable to choose on an informed basis, then his dollar is wasted, his health and safety may be threatened, and the national economy suffers. So not only did John F. Kennedy recognize that this was an individualistic issue, but it's also a collective issue. And so part of why we're here today is to get the word out, if you will, to create better, educated, and informed consumers. Because if you have an informed consumer, you have things that you can do to protect yourself, and it's good for everyone. So, with that said, as I indicated to everyone beforehand, we're going to be covering a series of different issues today, ranging from loans to telemarketing to everything in between. And so hopefully we'll touch on some things that will interest just about everybody. But before we do that, I do want to start out with scams. And scams come in a variety of modes. They come in a variety of disguises. And before I really get into, and we're talking about kind of 3 scams to really be thinking about, 3 common scams. Before we do that, I do want to talk a little bit about why people fall for scams. And people fall for scams for very embedded psychological reasons. That's part of our biological makeup. And the concept is this notion of defaulting to truth. And that is, biologically speaking, people default to truth. So meaning that when you're talking with somebody, you typically assume what you're being told is true. That's just the way we're set up. And in fact, there is a reason for that from a biological standpoint, because if you sat there and questioned everything that everybody ever told you in your entire life, you couldn't get anything done, right? So people naturally default to truth. And when people don't default to truth, or when people, to get out of this notion of default to truth, you've got to have a counter story that's more powerful than what's being told to you. And so, if you kind of take that perspective that, gee, okay, so I'm hearing something from somebody, somebody's trying to sell me something, right? The concept is listen to what they're saying, understand your psychology, which is the default to truth. But if something sounds, maybe a little too good to be true, maybe you ought to try to dig in there a little bit further and just recognize that while you want to believe the person, that perhaps you need to be a little bit skeptical. And this is something I practice actually when I'm dealing with people, when I'm looking at products and services. Of course, I understand you want to take things that people tell you at face value, but the reality is there are a lot of scams out there. And I'm not saying you question every single thing that everybody's telling you, but I think if you're a little bit aware and aware of this notion of defaulting to truth, that you'll be better able to protect yourself. So with that said, 3 pretty common scams that we're seeing nowadays. The first scam is impersonation scams. So this happens in a variety of circumstances. It happens in which people get emails, for instance, where, and we actually just got one from the law school dean, in fact. It wasn't him, but somebody was impersonating the law school dean and said, oh, gee, we really need to get some contact information. We need some help with a product. Please give me a phone call. And these impersonation scams come out in a lot of other ways too. For instance, it can be a situation in which you get a telephone call, for instance, from, and this happens particularly with the elderly, from a grandson, right? Grandson's in prison. He's hired a lawyer. The lawyer needs you to wire or send money to go get the son out of jail. It actually happens that way. And so you might say, well, what can I do to protect myself? Well, for instance, when you get that phone call from the lawyer, it's always important to ask questions, right? Ask questions. Ask questions that perhaps only your grandson would know. What's your preference? What are the things? What was the name of his first dog, or what was the name? The maiden name of his mother. Right? Ask questions that only that person would know, and you can better protect yourself. Additionally, when you're getting those email impersonation attacks, it's also important to kind of really look at those email addresses, right? So this particular one wasn't from the dean at all. It just had his name, but if you actually looked at the email address, it wasn't from him. These are pretty easy to fall for, but again, this notion of not defaulting to truth and assuming that you get a phone call out of the blue from a grandson or a loved one, perhaps you need to dig a little bit deeper. Check cashing scams are actually also pretty prevalent, and those are situations in which somebody contacts you and says, look, you've won $1 million, I have $1 million for you, I need your help, please deposit this money in your account, and then they call you up and say, oh, well, and at first it looks like it's legitimate, right? It's a real check, you deposit it, it might even show up on your bank account, and then they ask you to go ahead and wire the money out to them, right? And because they need some sort of advance payment. And what happens is the check actually takes a little bit of time for the banks to process the check. The check bounces, but you now have wired out some of the money that's actually in your account. And so, again, watch this notion of defaulting to truth. People don't call you up very often to offer you $1 million or $10,000 or $5,000. And so that's something you can kind of be aware of. A third type of scam are actually the largest. This, if you go on the Federal Trade Commission's website, they track scams nationwide. More people lose money on romance scams than anything else. And so a romance scam is a situation in which it happens a lot with online dating services, where you get somebody who likes you, but then starts to ask you to wire them money and send them money. And it's just not a situation where it just happens immediately. Often people really work to gain your trust, work over a period of months even to get your trust, but then they start asking for money and asking for things. And so that's one to really watch out for. And how do you protect yourself? Well, actually meeting the person. The FTC actually recommends that you meet a person before you start wiring them money. And this is something, and I was actually at an event here at the public library with the FTC, and there was a story told where a person lost, over $100,000. The gentleman just kept on wiring money out and ended up being somebody who didn't really exist. So those are 3 common scams.
But doesn't it happen in person too?
It can happen in person. Oftentimes, though, these, with the advent of these online dating services, it's particularly bad, though, online. A lot of fake profiles out there, a lot of people who are pretending to be somebody else. And so, again, this is not your typical kind of the run-of-the-mill where maybe a relationship doesn't work out. I mean, these are actual people who are pretending to be other people. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on scams. There's the FTC, and that's just one of the materials that we have, actually tracks scams that are happening across the country. And we'll, at the end of the presentation, there are some handouts here. We'll talk a little bit about where you can go on the FTC's website to get a list of kind of the more common scams. And they keep a pretty updated list. Let's move on. Next thing I want to talk to you about, and again, the idea here is we're going to cover a whole host of consumer issues, is privacy. And the one thing about privacy is that people don't actually understand what it really means. So privacy comes in a couple different ways. It's the use of information as well as how your information is being protected. And so, from a consumer protection standpoint, how can you protect the way that your information is being used? Well, one of the ways that you can protect the way that your information is being used is to be aware that when you give out your telephone number, when you give out your address, when you give out your credit card information, looking at the legitimacy of the entity that's requesting it and always asking why. Why do you need my information? So one of the things I do is often when you're checking out at stores or you're checking out at various places, they might ask for your telephone number. I always ask, why do you need that information? Why do you need this information for me to complete this purchase, right? Because I'm cognizant and careful with who has my information, the reasons why they want to use or have that information. Because the question is, how are they going to use it? Because oftentimes what happens is your consumer information is being shared, right? Everybody has these phones, right? And a lot of information goes into them. In fact, these phones, they know more about us than our significant others do. And the information just doesn't stay. It's being shot out. And some of it is, you can't protect yourself against everything, but in certain instances, when somebody's asking you, fill out this form or give me this information, it's important to ask why. Ask yourself why if there's nobody to ask, but if there's a live person, ask why. Why do you need this information? Can I avoid not giving you this information? And in that way, you can help protect your information or how it's being used by just not giving it, which is the best protection. Data breaches. This is a big problem that's happening right now. So again, kind of related to how your information is being used. Also relates to how your information is being protected. And what's happening a lot now is, and you've heard it in a couple different there's been a couple of really large ones, including Equifax. This is a credit bureau, had all this consumer information, and somebody got in their system, and they the information was stolen, essentially. Now, what usually happens is when there's a big data breach, when somebody gets information, the company that's gotten the information stolen from them they're supposed to give you notice, right, of that fact. And if you get one of these notices, it's really important for you to try to reach out to a lawyer or somebody, at least run it by them and see, is there some relief that's available? What can I do to protect myself? Because what we're finding is these data breaches are happening more and more and more. And it's one of these things where you may have had your information stolen, perhaps nothing will ever happen. But there's always the risk that perhaps later, sometime down the road, you could have a real problem. So it's important once you get these letters to take them seriously. And that really relates also to not only is consumer information sometimes being taken, we're also seeing it with respect to medical records and medical information, where people are getting into systems and taking some of that information. And when that happens, you have certain rights under federal law to get additional protections as well as to bring an action. And so if that happens, certainly need to reach out to a lawyer to get some help. All right, cars. So we're going to hit a lot of different topics. Cars, and some of these are kind of the bigger hot button type issues. So we included cars in the presentation because a lot of people buy cars. And it usually typically is the second largest purchase that they make in terms of size. And it's also very important because it's expensive to buy a car. It's not a cheap thing. And so I picked 3 things to talk about cars with you about, because we can't cover the whole, cover everything. But those 3 things are warranties, as is, and Carfax. These are 3 kind of basically 3 tips for you. So the first thing is warranties. So under West Virginia law, there are certain warranties that go along when you buy a car. There's a thing called an implied warranty of merchantability and an implied warranty of fitness for a particular purpose. And most people know what a warranty is, but basically you're guaranteeing that I'm buying a car and it's in good working order. Now, under West Virginia law, and this is very important, when you buy a new car, in certain used cars, a dealer is not allowed to say that there's no warranty. Right? You're not allowed to say that unless there's certain circumstances that they can't. We're going to talk about that. And so what that means is when you buy a car, it is supposed to work like a car for a reasonable amount of time. That's what a warranty means, right? So if you get a car, for instance, and after a couple of days of driving it doesn't work, you should be able to go back to the dealership and say, look, my car doesn't work. I want my money back or I want it fixed. And if they say no, then you may have a cause of action. And so the idea is that, look, cars sold in West Virginia need to work like a car for a reasonable amount of time. Okay? The one difference is there are certain types of cars that are used, cars that have over 100,000 miles or that are 7 years old. Under those circumstances, a dealership can sell those cars as is. They've got to give you certain disclaimers, but what that means is you're basically assuming the risk that the car is not going to work like a car. Now, again, it only applies to used cars and older cars, but dealers are allowed to sell those as is. But new car purchases, cars that are not that old, used cars that are not that old, they do have what we call that those implied warranties, which will protect you for a reasonable amount of time. The third concept that I want you to think about when you're buying a car is this notion of a Carfax report. And that's another thing you can do to protect yourself. Always request and ask for a Carfax report. So a Carfax report tells you, when you're buying a used car, who the prior owners were and how, whether it was wrecked and the condition of the car. The one thing though to keep in mind about a Carfax report is sometimes they're not updated. So, while Carfax report is important, there are limitations. So just because a car gets a clean bill of health on the Carfax doesn't necessarily mean that it hasn't been flooded. And one of the very worst times to buy a car is when there's been a series of floods. Because what happens is dealers, you might get a trade-in. The dealer doesn't necessarily keep that car on its lot. It might go over to an auction, which then gets picked up by a wholesaler, which then gets picked up by another dealership. And so you might have a car that was, flooded and a couple states away is being sold here in West Virginia. And so you always have to be a little bit cognizant of that. There's been a lot of flooding somewhere, a big hurricane, and you're seeing this great discount on a car. Be a little bit cautious. So that's it for cars.
You said that if they had less than 100,000 miles and they were less than 7 years old, they should work properly for
a reasonable amount of time, and that's the standard.
Okay, but there's
no way
to quantify that.
Well, a reasonable amount of time. Certainly, if you ask me what a reasonable amount of time is, I think a year would be a reasonable amount of time. Certainly, if you've had a car for a couple of months and you're having problems with it, that's not a reasonable amount of time. And so a little bit of it is interpretation, but the idea is that if you think about it too, a typical express warranties for often 3 years. So, that could be a reasonable amount of time too under the circumstances. So the idea is that even when a dealer is trying to tell you, no, you didn't buy the extended warranty or you didn't do all that, assuming it's not a really old car, it comes with a warranty. Talk about small loans. And again, the idea is that people are going to have a variety of issues. Some people will be car purchasers, some people aren't car purchasers. Some people might be interested in getting small loans. So what we're talking about here are relatively small loans. These are not, for instance, car loans. We're not talking about car loans. We're not talking about mortgage loans. We're talking about what are called unsecured small loans. This is stuff where it's not attached to any piece of property. It might be for a couple $1,000s. It might be for a couple $100. Under West Virginia law, the maximum interest rate that can be charged for one of these small loans is 18%. Right? Now, there's certain circumstances in which credit cards get to charge a higher rate. I believe it's up to 30%. But beyond that, interest rates can't exceed those thresholds. And so what you'll see are these entities called payday lenders who will sometimes charge 100% or 150% or 200%. Now, payday lending in West Virginia is illegal, but there are payday lenders that are allowed to operate in Ohio and some of the other states around West Virginia. So people will sometimes get involved with those. Additionally, there's been more and more the increase of online payday lending, essentially where you go get onto these online services, and it doesn't exactly feel like payday lending, but it is a form of it. So, for instance, some people, for instance, they would like to be paid every single day, meaning you might have a situation which you get paid twice a month, and there are services that you can buy where they essentially will give you a loan, an advance on your paycheck, and they'll break it up. You'll be paid Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday. Now it's not going to exceed what your paycheck is, and they'll charge you a fee for that service. But that fee is often pretty high, and so we're seeing more and more of that sort of thing. So it's not technically payday lending, but it's just another form of it. So that's something to watch out for. The other thing to watch out for in terms of small loans is the storefront lenders are actually some of the and we don't see as many of these, but there used to be a lot of brokers working in West Virginia. There also used to be a number of people who, like the Beneficial West Virginia's, One Main is one that's still operating here. Again, you can get, I'm not saying that all of those terms are bad loans or anything like that, but oftentimes you just need to be aware that those are going to be really high interest loans, right? And so, and there may be some cheaper forms of credit that are out there. Landlord-tenant. So, I don't know if anybody rents. Anybody rent here?
Not yet.
Okay. So, 3 concepts or 3 tips for landlord-tenant issues. The first one is, and this is actually the most important one, before renting, look at the apartment during the day. So many people, so many students particularly, look at model units. It's like, okay, well, we have this model unit over here. This is what your apartment typically will look like. And what happens is, and we've got a student right now who dealing with this right now, the apartment they actually get doesn't look like the apartment that they thought they were going to get. For instance, it may not be finished, or it may have black mold, or it may have other problems in it, right? And so the idea is, when you're going to rent something, make sure you actually see the unit you're going to rent. The other thing is, look at it during the day. And that's really important. Because if you try to go in the evening, maybe it's dark out. Maybe the lighting's not real good. And so you don't see the stains on the ceiling where the water is leaking from the upstairs unit down into your unit. And so it's really important to look at it during the day. The second concept that I'd like to kind of emphasize for folks is this notion of habitability. And so, just like we were talking about with respect to cars, there are certain warranties that landlords have to make to tenants. And one of the concepts is this notion of habitability. And they have to essentially warrant that the place that you're getting is going to be habitable, right? And that means the water, has running water. It means that the plumbing works, right? That means that you don't have big leaks that are dripping down on your head. There are certain things that they have to do to make sure that the place is habitable. And you have certain rights, including the ability to bring an action if the place is not habitable. And if you're having problems like that, we'll talk about some folks who might be able to help you. The third thing is eviction. The landlord does not have a right to simply kick you out if you don't pay your rent, or, for instance, if you're having a problem with your apartment and you're withholding rent because it's not habitable. They have to go through a process. So this is not a situation, again, and if this happens to you, you would have a right against your landlord if they were just essentially just throw your stuff out without giving you notice and without taking care of some of those problems, especially if the place is not habitable. I don't know if we have any folks with student loans. I think you probably have a few student loans, and for-profit schools. So this has been a particularly big issue for people. And that is, over the last couple of years, there's been the failure of a lot of what we call for-profit schools. These are schools that you have to pay money for to get, for instance, technical certifications. ITT Tech is one. Corinthian Colleges was another. There was actually a law school that failed recently. And basically what was happening was people were being told, look, come into this school, we'll give you a certain certification. We have these great jobs that you'll get after graduation. And what was happening was none of those representations were true. The certifications were wrong and the people couldn't get jobs. And they were left with huge consumer debts, talking sometimes $20,000, $30,000. And under those circumstances, there are certain rights that somebody has where you would be able to bring a suit under an unfair, deceptive act or practices statute. You have to talk to a lawyer about that, but you can actually get some relief. Additionally, there are certain programs that are available where you can get loan forgiveness. And it's under the exceptions for closed schools. So essentially, if you've gone to one of these schools, and there's been a lot of people who have gone to these schools, and you found yourself in a situation in which school closed on you, then you may be able to get your loan forgiveness or your loan forgiven. Additionally, bankruptcy in certain circumstances, limited circumstances, can also provide some relief from student loans, albeit it can be very difficult to get that relief, but it's something to consider. Home purchases and refinances. So if you're going to buy your house, and if you're going to be in a situation where you're going to refinance your house, these are 3 things that you might want to consider. First thing is on the purchase. Always get a home inspection. So many people skip that step because it's usually $1,000 or more to get a home inspection. The problem is you are not trained to identify the problems that exist with a home that you're going to try to purchase. I mean, are you going to be qualified to get back behind the wall and look for black mold? No. Are you going to be qualified to get into the attic and look for stains and other evidences that the roof is leaking? No. Are you going to be able to look at the foundation and figure out whether the house is actually built on a solid foundation? So it's really important to always get a home inspection before purchasing. Additionally, watch, and I actually am dealing with a case right now where somebody has what's called a rent-to-own agreement. Essentially, these are situations in which the owner says, don't worry about getting a loan, you just pay me rent, and at the end of the day, you can have the house, but you just pay me rent. The problem with these rent-to-own transactions is that they are just what they sound like. It's actually just a rental agreement. And so there's actually no ultimate obligation for somebody to sell you that property. Additionally, in the case I'm dealing with right now, the landlord didn't pay his own mortgage. And the person got a notice from the bank to get out of the house because the house had been foreclosed on. This is after she'd made all her rent payments. And so there are real issues with these types of transactions, and you want to definitely protect yourself. Additionally, when you've gotten your house and you've gotten a mortgage, oftentimes you'll hear things called, well, you can get a home equity loan, you can refinance your home loan. You get a lot of these offers, and you see them on TV from time to time. And basically the idea is, well, you can take your debts, you can refinance, and you can consolidate, these consolidation loans. These are also things you really want to watch out for. There's nothing wrong with refinancing, trying to get a lower interest rate on your mortgage loan. But what they'll often try to do, some of the outfits that aren't so great, is they'll try to get you to refinance all your credit card debt onto your house loan, right? And the reason that's bad is because, if things were to work out, if you have an illness or somebody's family gets sick or you lose your job, the credit card company can't take your house. But if you don't pay your mortgage loan, then you could be in a bad situation. You could lose your house. And so it's always bad to take credit card debt, what we call unsecured debt, and try to lump that onto your house, even for short-term savings. So let's say you've gotten that house, you've gotten that mortgage. What are some things to think about when you're dealing with the entity, what's called a loan servicer, who's collecting your payments? There's 3 things I'd like folks to think about, and that is there are restrictions on the types of fees that a mortgage company who's collecting your payments can charge you. For instance, they're not supposed to charge you attorney's fees if you're in a default situation. So if you're in a situation where you've come into hard times and you're in default, and you start seeing a bunch of fees on your bills and things like that, you probably need to talk to a lawyer. Another problem that we often see is returned or not credited payments. And that is a situation in which you make a payment, and this happens where the loan servicer won't take it. They won't take it because they don't consider it to be a full payment, or they'll take your payment, but they won't actually apply it to your loan. So you'll see in your statement that you've made a payment, but your principal and interest isn't being reduced. Under those circumstances, it's another situation which you really need to talk to a lawyer. So you want to make sure that your payments are being applied. And under the law, a loan servicer, somebody who's collecting your payments, has to credit the payments to your loan. They're not allowed to just let them sit there. They actually have to, once they get a full payment, credit those payments. The third issue, just to be thinking about, and this is also a situation which you really need to talk to a lawyer or somebody who's knowledgeable, is if you get into a situation in which, and most loans are they do have what's called an escrow. And an escrow is a separate account that deals with taxes and insurance. And so most loans are escrowed, some are not. And so what happens is, basically, is through an escrow account, a lender collects a certain amount of money from you in addition to your principal and interest to pay for those two things. And they manage that, meaning they pay the insurance company, they make sure that the taxes are paid. Every once in a while, I'll run into situations and see where the loan servicer is not paying the insurance company. And what happens is the insurance company will cancel insurance, or, for instance, the loan servicing company won't recognize that you do have insurance on your house. And they'll do a thing called forced place insurance, where the company will actually put insurance on your house. Under those circumstances, if you start getting forced place insurance notices and you think that you had the insurance in place, or you get a weird cancellation notice in the mail, it's really important to get to the lawyer very quickly. These problems with escrow can get out of control very rapidly, and they can lead to really bad results. I've had situations in which people have made every single one of their payments on time, every single payment on time. But because of a problem with an escrow, a person gets into a situation in which they're literally on the brink of losing their house. Looks like our food is here. Let's bring them in.
You can go in front of you. You stole your tables. We put one upstairs. That's good.
So we just have a couple more minutes, and then we'll get to the food. So debt relief for credit repair companies. So let's say that somebody gets into some debt. You start getting these notices in the mail from what are called debt relief or credit repair companies. Sometimes you get phone calls too from them. And basically these are companies who say, look, we understand that you're having trouble paying your bills, contact us and we'll help you negotiate with your creditors, get you lower interest rates, settle your debts. Or they'll say, we'll help you fix your credit. There's been a lot of instances, and I've dealt with some of these companies, in which essentially these are fraudsters, basically scams. And some things to look out for if you get contacted by one of these entities. If somebody says you have to pay upfront fees before you get a service, then you know it's definitely a scam. That's illegal. You're not allowed to take upfront fees. You also, if somebody promises you a quick fix for credit, pay this fee and we'll take care of your bad credit, that's also a pretty good indication that it's a scam. The other thing is always pay your mortgage. Some of these companies will contact you and say, gee, we'll help you with your credit, we'll help you with debt relief, we'll negotiate with your mortgage company. Make your payments to us. Never do that. And you might say, well, I'd never fall for something like that, but it goes back to that concept we were talking about, defaulting to truth. People want to believe what they're being told is true. And so I have dealt with two separate situations in which people fell into one of these, or got in contact with one of these debt relief companies, were contacted by them, paid fees up front, and then started making their mortgage payments to the company instead of to their mortgage company. In both instances, the people lost their homes because the mortgage company wasn't getting the money. And in one instance, we were able to get the house back. In another instance, we weren't able to get the house back. And oftentimes, these companies are essentially scam artists, and so there is no money, no ability to get money, back from the companies. So this is a really big issue, and it's something to definitely try to protect yourself from. Credit reports. So, so we have 3 large credit bureaus right now: Equifax, TransUnion, Experian. I knew I was going to miss one. And there's a lot of other credit bureaus that are out there. You have a right under the law to have accurate credit reported, meaning if there's inaccurate credit and inaccurate marks on your credit report, you have a right to fix that or have that fixed. And I would suggest to you at least once a year, and you can do this, you can get a free credit report and at least check your credit. I think you should check it more often than that, but at least once a year you have a right to a free credit report. And additionally, you have right to accurate information. And if there is inaccurate information, the credit bureau can be held liable and held responsible, as well as the companies that are doing the inaccurate reporting. Now, you have to do certain things in order to hold them liable, i.e. you have to provide notice to them that there's inaccurate information. And if they don't fix those credit reports, then you can do something about it. But I would suggest to you, if you have information that's inaccurate and you've let the credit bureau know and you've let the company's reporting know, and if it's still not fixed, you should definitely talk to a lawyer about that. Telemarketers, my favorite. So who gets telephone calls, like robocalls, right? Where they say, please, I got one today, literally. In fact, and it said if I've been paying my bills on time and I'm eligible for a reconsolidation of my credit card debt. And I was like, oh, that's great. No. This happens a lot. We're getting inundated by these what's called pre-recorded. And these pre-recorded calls, and of course, these are the calls in which a robot essentially is talking to you. Press 1 if you want this service. The thing to think about with respect to these is that oftentimes those pre-recorded calls that you're getting are usually from scam artists. Not all the time. Sometimes they're actually legitimate companies who are sending those things, but nonetheless, under certain circumstances, I know it can be driving you crazy, right? You might have a cause of action, especially if those pre-recorded calls are going to your cell phone, right? And you don't have any type of relationship to the person who's calling you, then you could have a cause of action to go ahead and get those calls or to force the company to stop calling you. Now, the better approach is, if you don't want to have these types of telephone calls, 2 things. The first thing is get on the do not call list. It's the FCC maintains the do not call list. If you go on their website, you can sign up for the do not call list. You put your telephone numbers on there, and they're not supposed to call you. Now, that doesn't always work that way, but they're not supposed to. And if they continue to call you, then you could have a cause of action to force them to stop calling you. The second thing is, and it goes back to remember the privacy conversation that we had earlier, be cognizant of who's asking for your telephone number. So when I, for instance, go check into a hotel or I'm shopping in a grocery store, I never give any of those entities my telephone number. I mean, for instance, why does Lowe's need to know what my telephone number is? Go ahead.
I wonder the same thing when I shop at Justice. They ask me that, what is your telephone number? What is your email?
Why? And the question is, it goes back to privacy. Do you know for a fact that the information that you've just given to them is going to stay there? Or is it going to be sold to some sort of third-party affiliate marketer? You don't know that. You could ask the person there, and often they'll say, oh, of course, we never sell any of this information. It's safe. Until I see something like that in writing, I don't default to truth, right? I question. I say, gee, is the information I'm actually being provided, is that actually accurate? And I always default to not giving the information. There's also a thing called an internal do not call list, where, for instance, somebody calls you up, even if you're not on the do not call list, and you tell somebody, look, don't call me. They're not supposed to call you. Other issues, arbitration. So this is a big issue right now with consumers. What arbitration is Oftentimes, when you buy something, when you sign up for a service, you get a form contract, which none of us ever read. And at the end of that form contract is a clause in there that says that you cannot bring your case in court if you have a dispute. You've got to go submit to what's called arbitration. Now, people who like arbitration, the companies who ask for it, and other folks say, look, arbitration, it's a lot faster than court. You can just resolve your dispute a lot more easily. But what a lot of folks who are practicing consumer protection recognize is that oftentimes your remedies are limited. The time you would have to file a lawsuit can be limited. Also, you don't actually get in front of a jury. It's all decided by somebody who's not a judge, but it's just some third party. And usually it has to be a lawyer, but it's not somebody, again, like a judge who's deciding your case. And so I bring up the issue of arbitration for a couple different reasons. Number one, sometimes in agreements you have the ability to opt out. And most consumer protection advocates would tell you you will always want to try to opt out of an arbitration agreement if you have the ability to do so. You don't always have the ability to do so. And if you can't opt out, you need to at least know that, generally speaking, when you do have a consumer transaction, this doesn't apply to every consumer transaction, but that oftentimes you're going to be dealing with an arbitration clause. All right, so we have a series of different handouts. And the first one that I want to talk about very briefly is what we call a consumer's bill of rights. And on here, basically, these are 10 protections that exist under the law. So even if you have a debt, and even if you find yourself in a position in which you can't pay that debt, there are certain things that a creditor can't do. And these are kind of the 10 highlights, if you will. And so the first thing is, your creditor, no matter if you're not going to pay your debt, cannot threaten you or accuse you of fraud. And so, for instance, threaten to commit a crime, threaten you with violence. They can't do that sort of thing. Go ahead.
Attempted humor doesn't apply to the mafia, though, right?
Right.
Attempted humor.
Yeah, I get it.
Attempted humor.
Additionally, you have a right to your wages and Social Security payments. And so basically what that means is there's certain limitations on if you don't pay your debt, and let's say a creditor gets a judgment against you. Well, there's certain amounts of money that they can't take. And so, if you're a situation in which you're getting your wages garnished or your bank accounts, you need to contact the lawyer immediately. But there are certain restrictions there. Another one is you have the right to be free from calls at unusual times. So the point is that, look, a creditor can't call you at midnight or at 7 o'clock in the morning. There are actually temporal or time frames in which they can or can't call you. You have the right to be free from profanity. You can't be cussed at. And that kind of relates to the first one. You have the right to privacy, meaning a creditor or somebody, a debt collector, can't call up your neighbor and say, so-and-so here owes a debt, and they need to pay it and they're not paying it. And that's illegal if they do that. You have the right to the truth, meaning a debt collector is not allowed to lie to you. You have a right to know who owns your debt. So oftentimes, your debt is being collected by somebody you may not even know who they are, right? And because they're collecting on behalf of, for instance, a credit card company or somebody like that, and you have a right to know who they are and who they're collecting for. You have a right to be free from unlawful debt collection fees. And so there are restrictions, for instance, under West Virginia law, somebody is not allowed to charge you collection costs with a collector's fee. They can charge you, obviously, the principal you owe and the interest that you owe, but they're not allowed to make up fees and collect them from you. You have the right to know if your debt is too old to be the subject of a lawsuit. So there are certain debts in which they're really old. And it depends on the particular type of debt, but really old debt is not debt, for instance, that somebody could sue you on. They may be able to try to collect it from you, but they couldn't file a lawsuit. And there are certain disclosures that you're entitled to get at the bottom of, and usually they happen they're in the bottom of the body of a debt collection letter that says, look, this debt is too old, and we cannot file a lawsuit against you. And you also have the right to direct all calls to your attorney. So let's say you were represented by counsel. A debt collector is not free just to call you outside of contacting the lawyer. And if you say, look, you have to direct your calls to the attorney, then, and if they don't honor that, there could be liability for that. So just basically 10 things to keep in the back of your mind. A debt collector is just not allowed to do anything to collect the debt. There are some really strict requirements that exist. And so if you find yourself in a position in which one of these requirements is being violated, you should certainly contact a lawyer. All right. A couple more. Places to get information. So this second handout is just a series of places where you can get information. So if you've got a problem or you want some more or additional consumer information, this gives you essentially 10 places in which you can get information. So very quickly, Federal Trade Commission, they have a lot of information. They're the federal agency, for instance, that collects a lot of information about scams. And so if you want to know what the current scams are out there, look at the FTC. Better Business Bureau, that kind of lets you know. Most people know the BBB, but if it's a company that's subject to the Better Business Bureau, you can get some information about whether they're legitimate, whether they've had complaints and things of that nature. The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is very similar to the Federal Trade Commission. They deal with slightly different issues. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, for instance, does a lot of things with respect to loan companies, and so they're a good resource there too. Annual credit report, that's a place where you can get that free credit report. Legal Aid of West Virginia, they maintain a lot of information on their website, and the resources that they offer include but are limited to a lot of things we covered here, particularly in the landlord-tenant arena and so forth. West Virginia Senior Legal Aid, this is another really great resource here in West Virginia. That can help out seniors and talk about current scams and places to get help if you're a victim of the scams. The Office of the West Virginia Attorney General. They have a service, a Consumer Protection Division, that has both information as well as if you find yourself in a bad spot where you've been scammed or you're having a dispute with a company. Oftentimes they can help people out. Now, they can't help out everybody, and oftentimes what they can do is just kind of log a complaint in their database, but if enough people complain, then they'll often bring an enforcement action. But there's also sometimes where they can work out an informal resolution depending upon the nature of the dispute. National Consumer Law Center, NCLC, that just has a whole host of information. I mean, all the things that I talked about today, if you want to get into kind of greater detail, they have a resource. It's called Surviving Debt. It's free. It's a book, essentially, and you can get it online. I actually just ordered it, and it's great. And it's got everything you basically need to know about debt. The West Virginia Division of Banking. So this is the entity that regulates banks in West Virginia. So if you have a dispute with your lender, oftentimes they can help out with that, depending upon who that lender is. And then also the West Virginia Judiciary keeps, if you find yourself in trying to represent yourself and you need some forms, West Virginia Judiciary has some forms on its website. Now again, generally speaking, always good to try to find a lawyer when you get into one of these problems, especially with respect to these consumer issues. But there are some resources that are available if you're just looking for to try to help yourself. And that brings up, where can you get help? And this other handout, 10 places to get help, lists lawyers, or it's not lawyers, but where you can possibly get lawyers, as well as some of these other entities that we talked about, including legal aid, senior legal aid, who will actually provide direct representation of consumers. Another one on this list is the clinical law program. The West Virginia University College of Law maintains a free clinic, and it's got the number on there. So if you find yourself as a victim of one of these things and you're having a hard time finding a lawyer, you can call the clinic. There is a legal information hotline, and the number's there, and that's staffed by members of the West Virginia Bar. When you're having a problem with this is actually an important one. When you're having a problem with a utility, oftentimes you can't bring a lawsuit in court. You have to go to what's called the Public Service Commission. So this is, you're talking about your water bill, sometimes your phone bill, things that are overseen by the Public Service Commission. And when you have those disputes, it's important to call the Public Service Commission because they actually have people who exist to handle these types of disputes, and sometimes they can be pretty effective. I had somebody who contacted me with a problem with their phone service. Essentially, it was always down, it wouldn't work. And they contacted the Public Service Commission. The Public Service Commission got involved and were able to resolve that service issue. So don't lose sight of that. So this one's a really important one. Lastly, if you need additional information, that's my contact information. Pop me an email, as well as you can get my contact information off of our website, which is www.theccle.org. So with that said, let's move to the Ben.
I have one question. So you talked a lot about getting a lawyer. One question I have is two parts. One, lawyers are kind of expensive, so how does someone afford a lawyer? And two, if they can't afford one, I guess that you would tell us where to go to find one, wherever we find one.
So that's a fair question. Oftentimes, the lawyers who are practicing in this space work off of what's called a contingency fee. And the way that works is you don't get charged unless and until there's a recovery for you. And so oftentimes, when you're in a situation and you've contacted the lawyer and they're wanting to charge you a fee for some of these services, you need to be a little bit aware of, perhaps you're not getting somebody who's regularly practicing in this space. Additionally, if this is a situation where you want to have or get a sense of who's practicing in these particular areas or who's kind of specializes, one resource, and I should put it on the list, is NACA. It's NACA. And the website is www.naca.org. And NACA keeps a list of consumer lawyers who practice in each state. And so that actually can be a pretty good resource. There is the West Virginia Lawyer Referral Service, too, which is on the list. It's number 2, where you can look up lawyers on from the bar directory. And then a series of these entities, including Legal Aid of West Virginia, Mountain State Justice, West Virginia Senior Legal Aid, the clinical program that I mentioned, actually provide free legal services. So those are all ones to keep in mind. Now, Mountain State Justice is a nonprofit law firm. I mean, they will do a contingency fee, as we talked about. But again, that's not a situation where you're going to be responsible for paying upfront fees and costs. Yep. Any other questions?
I have 2 questions. One, can debt be bought and sold by collectors? And 2, do you have to be notified if your debt is bought or sold, and what cost or what price?
So yes, your debt can be bought and sold. Debt is frequently bought and sold, especially old debt. And so there are companies that specialize in buying old debt. debt.
And we have a term for it in the industry. It's called zombie debt. It's like old debt that somehow gets revived. And that's really where we start getting to issues where the debt is so old that A, they're not allowed to sue you, even if you don't pay, and B, in some situations, it's so old that they can't report it to the credit bureaus. And they're supposed to provide notices. So that's the first thing. Your second question was, do they have to get your consent, or do they have to notify you?
Yeah, for like instance, if they were to sell your debt for 40 cents on the dollar to another.
They do not have to inform you as to how they purchased your debt or how much they purchased your debt for. What they do have to inform you of, though, if they try to collect from you, they've got to identify the original creditor, and they've got to identify themselves as the owner. Yeah.
Right. Along those lines, say your debt was with a car dealership. You're defaulting on that. The debt collector buys your debt. But your original contract is with the car dealer. Does that your contract go with the person who bought your debt, or is that a whole?
So most contracts can be what's called assigned. So basically, I'm the original creditor. I can sell your debt to a debt collector, and there's usually what's called an assignment of that loan to that new entity.
Was that in the original contract?
Most of the contracts say that they're assignable, and there are certain restrictions on some debts that aren't assignable. And there have been cases in the past where that we call it a chain of title has not been established, right? There's not a record of an assignment. There's no information that indicates that the new entity is allowed to collect. And in certain circumstances, you can do things and say, no, you can't collect from me because you don't own my debt, or you haven't been able to prove it. Other questions?
What about mortgages?
Yeah.
Can they sell your mortgage to someone
Yes.
else without notifying
Yes.
you?
Well, not without notifying you. They have to provide you a notice. And they'll say, essentially, basically when that happens, you'll get a notice of servicing transfer is usually the title of the document, which just basically says, look, your new loan servicer is this entity. That's not necessarily going to tell you that your debt was sold. And I'm trying to think back. Actually, let me think about that for a second. So your question is not. They have to notify you if your loan servicer changes. I mean, that's the person who's collecting your debt, right? They also have to identify when you get your loan whether they intend to sell your debt or not, your loan or not. So there's a disclosure, that big old stack of loan documents that says that, and I remember when I got my mortgage, my disclosure said, we sell 99.9% of all mortgages. So they don't keep them, they sell it to some other entity. And usually what that means is the right to collect your payments is also going to change too. It might be the entity that bought the debt, or it might be another entity that's hired by the entity who bought the debt, who's actually collecting your payments. But you get a notice, you're entitled under the law to get a notice of the new entity that's going to be collecting your payments. Yeah? Penalties for wiring money to somebody you don't know. So this is a situation in which, for instance, a bank were to wire money without your authorization, or somebody were to get a hold of your account and wire information or wire payments out, something like that. Meaning, somehow got access to your bank account?
Well, I mean, if it was through Western Union or MoneyGram.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So if you actually, for instance, like PayPal, this is one I know. There are certain situations in which you're entitled to a refund. That's pretty case specific, though. But you may have a right to go after, for instance, PayPal or Western Union or another entity that sends money out of your bank account, even especially when you don't authorize it. And you have actually an ability to grab the money back too for a certain period of time. Other questions?